Hi, my name is Susan Norwell, and I am an educational specialist and co-founder of Rett University. Here today just to speak to you about school placement. What? This is meant to be just a short little lesson. I don't know if it's a lesson, but a short little acknowledgement that placement decisions are never easy and there is no perfect placement. So let's start there. I want us to think about 5 placement options that are pretty prevalent in the U.S. This kind of runs the gamut, and probably in other countries too, though there might be less full inclusion in other countries and more self-contained separate. All of these kind of exist in these forms somewhere. The first model would be full inclusion. We'll talk about what that is. We'll talk about the advantages of full inclusion, and we will also talk about the disadvantages. So every single one of these is going to have a section on definition. What is it? What are the positive things about it, and what are the negatives? Because like I said, there's no perfect placement option. Second would be inclusion with support. The third one would be a self-contained educational room that's within a general education school. Those are cropping up all over the place in the States. Then there's self-contained multiple disability rooms. These rooms tend to be clustered in a school, so it might not be in the school that you would typically go to, like the self-contained educational rooms, but it is a multiple disability room that's kind of gathered across a district or maybe across a co-op. And then there are self-contained separate schools. So if you believe, and these are some main tenets, so these are some main tenets that I believe as an individual who has worked with a lot of individuals with Rett. It is also the core tenets of Rett University. And if you believe that kiddos with Rett know more than they show, if you believe that kiddos with Rett can learn to read, write, and communicate, if you believe that kiddos with Rett are social and need peers, neurotypical peers, to help bring out that social and to help connect with them, and if you agree that kiddos with Rett are complicated and that schools need training, that you're in the right place. Because these are the assumptions I am using when I am determining the positives and negatives to each one of the programs. So full disclosure here. I think educating a kiddo with Rett syndrome or an adult with Rett syndrome is like pushing a rock up a hill. You just have to decide, hashtag, what hill do you want to climb? It is not, and I'm not here to, it really sounds kind of depressing, doesn't it? And I don't mean to sound depressing. I find placement decisions to be rather exciting, and trying to figure out how to make things work is kind of what I love to do. Is I'm going to figure out how to make it work. But I know from experience there are some places, some settings where I have to do more work on certain things and less work on others. And so what hill do you want to climb? What work do you want to do? What are your personal strengths as a family? What are your personal strengths of your team, of your private team, in terms of how they can support the school? Because that last tenet was that all schools need training. I truly believe that's true when it comes to Rett syndrome. So let's look at full inclusion. Full inclusion is a kiddo is in, let's say they're going into 3rd grade. They are going to be in the 3rd grade classroom. They're going to have great peer models. General education has curriculum. It's not like they're doing curriculum by file cabinet or by what that teacher thinks they're going to learn that unit that they're going to explore. They have a systematic curriculum that's adopted by typically the entire district. Teachers are skilled at teaching reading. There's a lot of rich language models in a full inclusion classroom. Lots of community building that is going on in those classrooms. It is the child's home school. It is where everybody in their neighborhood will go to school. It is where their siblings would go to school. Good cognition could be supported in this full inclusion environment, and it's reflective of their neighborhood and community. Like I said, this is their neighborhood school. So when they go out in their neighborhood, they're going to see kids from their school. Which I think is one of the benefits of full inclusion. So on the plus side, this organized curriculum means that they do have a set of standards and they have a scope and sequence as to what they're going to be teaching. General education has really pushed in the last 10 years to have really rich, good literacy and math instruction. There's a lot of hands-on learning. There's a lot of excitement going on around learning literacy in general education classrooms. They also tend, more so as we get towards 3rd and 4th grade, to have a science and social studies curriculum. Again, an organized curriculum with a set of standards that have a scope and sequence as terms of what children should be learning in each age group. It has peers who could engage them. These are peers that could reach out to them, could learn how to use their device, could figure out how to communicate and get a yes/no from them so they can be included in group activities. And it could meet the cognitive strengths of our kiddos with Rett syndrome. It's a really interesting dynamic environment. And if you notice, there's a lot of coulds here, because on the roadblock sign, on the here's the rock I'm going to have to push up the hill if they're fully included, there's not a lot of understanding about Rett anywhere. I don't care if you're in a full inclusion classroom or you're in a self-contained school where the experts are, they don't get Rett. They need instruction to learn how to teach nonverbal kids to read, write, and decode. So you have a teacher in a full inclusion classroom who understands how to teach reading, but they don't know how to teach reading to nonverbal kids. Our kiddo's going to need a communication partner in that environment to support their communication, but who's going to train that aid? Who's going to support that aid? Who's going to do the modification and accommodations necessary so that your kiddo has access to this wonderful, rich curriculum? So in a full inclusion classroom, it's the gen ed teacher and your kiddo and maybe 29 other kids. So it is a big rock to push up a big hill to get all of this accomplished with that few people involved. Then there's inclusion with supports. The SLP, the OT, the PT can push in so they could support. The SLP could be supporting the communication. Special education teacher would be involved as a case manager. They can provide support in the general education class, and they could provide one-to-one instruction as needed. Social worker can get involved to engage with peers so that they can learn about Rett and how we would facilitate peer interaction within the classroom. So we have a lot of support possibilities in inclusion with supports. Now, in this blended program, the student really gets a lot of needs met. So they're in the classroom and seen as a part of the classroom. This is not mainstream where they're only coming in for lunch, art, and PE. They are actually in that classroom for the bulk of their time. So they are a part of the classroom. They are part of the classroom community. But because there's this blended program, they get a chance to have some pull-out, maybe one-to-one time. There's some quiet time for them too. If they are overwhelmed by everything going on in the general classroom, they might really like this pull-out time where they get some one-to-one attention. The special ed support from the SPED teacher can really help that gen ed teacher to be successful. And that one-on-one pull-out time can help move learning along. So I'm always struck when I'm in a general education classroom with how fast everything moves. For my kiddo to have enough repetition and turns to really solidify their learning, it might not happen in that large classroom setting. It might be in that smaller pull-out setting, then they're going to get that practice. So here's some of the roadblocks even to this model. They still don't understand Rett. Even the special ed teacher doesn't understand Rett because this teacher is probably an LD support teacher. She's a teacher used to working with kids that have learning disabilities or some minimal cognitive disabilities or some minimal behavioral problems. Not complex kids who are maybe in a wheelchair, have seizures, and use a talker. That might be something brand new for them. And like I said, I think running through all of these, people don't understand Rett. They have a hard time with the idea, especially in schools, that they don't respond to assessments the way they're used to. That can be a roadblock. They're definitely going to need instruction on how to teach nonverbal kids to read and write. So this special education person comes with some special education skills, I will tell you, as a teacher of grad students for 10 years, we had nothing that came close to how we would teach a nonverbal kid how to read, write, and decode. I wrote one course for the LBS 2 program. That's people who already have a special ed degree going on to get a master's in special ed. One course that was for complex kids. Autism, Rett syndrome, CP, just what are some of those complex kids and what some of their needs are. But how to teach them how to read, not in the curriculum of any university that I have seen. So we still need that communication partner to support their communication. But I got to tell you, our special education teachers don't know how to use a device, have probably never seen an eye gaze device. It's a very rare thing, Rett syndrome. An eye gaze device is very rare, so they're not going to know how to do that without training. And we still have the question of who's going to do the modification and accommodations, not because it shouldn't be the purview of the special education teacher, but how is her time being allocated? Is she going to have, or he going to have time to make the modifications and accommodations? And let's go back to the very first item. If they don't understand Rett, how are they going to know how to modify and accommodate? Now, I've worked in lots of situations where this has been the model, where the SPED teacher has been wide open in terms of wanting to learn, and it has worked really, really successfully. So these are hurdles that are able, and roadblocks that we're able to get past, but there has to be training and there has to be support from the outside to help them with this. So that's the hill you have to climb in this particular scenario. Self-contained classroom in general ed. These have been cropping up all over. These are smaller classrooms run by a special education teacher. There's typically a mix of special needs kids, typically not complex. So our kiddo would be like the included kid, so to speak, in these classrooms because they're not really dealing with complex kids. They are in the general education school that they would typically go to. And they do mainstreaming versus inclusion. So they'll mainstream out for lunch and PE and art and social studies. They might even have kids go into the regular education class for special projects and things. They typically have a very specific curriculum that they're wedded to, using what I call special ed curriculum. So there's a lot of reading programs that are special ed that are really horrible in my mind. They're boring. They're not really effective for our kids. And so having to move this teacher off of her favorite special ed curriculum might be one of those roadblocks. But here's the plus side. It's a smaller class size that can really help some highly distractible students or some kids that have a great deal of difficulty staying regulated. Because in this smaller classroom set, there are less kids, and they're responsible kind of for their own schedule. So if they need to work for 15 minutes and take a break for 10 minutes in a quiet part of the room, that's available to them. So you can see that there are plus sides for each kind of kid. We just have to decide what it is that would help them and what are the roadblocks that we personally want to handle and kind of push people on. There's a full-time SPED teacher running the room. They will have some behavioral supports in place. I have a little girl that's going to kindergarten. They don't have all-day kindergarten, and so she's going to do gen ed kindergarten in the morning and be in one of these self-contained classrooms in the afternoon. It's in her same building. That teacher runs a program, a pretty strict program of behavior supports, and we're like, we really don't need that. She doesn't have behavior. I don't want her earning stickers for good behavior. She has good behavior. We don't need to put this thing in place. And this BIP, they wanted to, write a behavioral intervention plan, which doesn't need a behavioral intervention plan. It doesn't have any behaviors. So that's a plus for a lot of kids that might need it. It might not be a plus for other kids who don't need it. All the kids in the classroom have issues, so they're a little bit of a slower pace. If they do any kind of group or two-on-two work, our kids aren't going to be bowled over. They're going to be more of an active participant in real time because of the needs of the rest of the classroom. My son had a really severe learning disability, and in high school, we were fortunate to be at that time before there was RTI. they had pull out small 8 kids, teacher and an aide, for every single one of his gen ed classes. So he got a full diploma. But he took history in a class where kids had processing issues, where they used lots of visuals and a lot of techniques to support them. They didn't do a lot of the fluff. They did the most important things. But because everybody had processing delays, he was able to be an active participant verbally in his class, and his verbal IQ in high school grew like 20 points, which is unheard of. And I think it's because he got practice. He wasn't getting out. People weren't reacting and answering things so fast that he never got a chance. He got a lot of chances. That was a plus for him. In this self-contained class, they're still not going to understand Rett. You may need to fight and argue for curriculum that's going to meet your kids' needs, their nonverbal specific needs, versus the favorite or the ordained curriculum in this special education class. I had a kid who in a special education class, and when I did the observation, they were doing Teach Town. And the child had a touch screen on the computer. She was left there in front of the computer. She's supposed to touch the screen to answer the questions. And I said to them afterwards, she can't use her hands, A. B, there was nobody with her so they could do partner-assisted scan. Why are we using this? And they said, well, this is what has been chosen by the district. I said, really? And do you give your blind kids books they have to read with their eyes? This is not meeting FAPE. It's not meeting a free and appropriate education for my kiddo if she can't access it. But I will tell you that administrators can get really married to certain curriculum because it's researched for a certain group of kids. And in this case, it was researched for kids with autism. My kid's in a classroom with kids with autism. Now what happens is they're expected to use the very same curriculum and the very same strategies, except, and Courtney says this all the time, and I totally agree, and I don't know if I said it first or she said it first, it doesn't matter. Many of the things that I've learned about Rett work with my kids with autism, but a lot of the things that work with my kids with autism don't work with my kids with Rett. And we've got to be careful about that, because there's a lot of, I'm going to tell you something, you're going to do it, and you are going to respond 10 times out of 10 in an autism classroom. And there's a lot of curriculum that they think is good for them. I would take some umbrage with that. But it is not good for our kids with Rett syndrome. So they're going to still need instruction on how to teach nonverbal kids to read, write, and decode. They're going to need help in understanding that our kids can be as complex as they are and not be cognitively impaired. They're used to thinking kids are cognitively impaired. So we've got to get over that roadblock. They're still going to need a communication partner to support their communication. I don't care how many aides they have in the classroom. I don't want them rotated on a daily basis, because no aide gets a chance to really learn the device. The kiddo's only going to be as good as the person using the device. They can have a morning aide and an afternoon aide. That's fine with me. But don't be rotating them around, which they do for kids with autism, so they don't get stuck on them. For our kids, that's not helpful because their anxiety goes up. So the people that are leading the class don't know how to support that communication partner either. Again, who's going to do the modification and accommodations? This teacher teaches a certain way, does things a certain way. Is she going to understand, or he going to understand Rett enough that they can make modifications and accommodations to support that student even in a special such self-contained classroom? There is still going to need to be modifications and accommodations to support them. So it's like, who's going to train? Who's going to allocate the time? How is this going to work? So there's lots of who's and lots of questions. And just because they're in a self-contained classroom doesn't mean all those roadblocks go away. They're still those same roadblocks. It just has the advantage of being in a little bit smaller environment and you're only dealing with one teacher. So let's look at 4 and 5. I'm going to kind of lump them together because I think our classrooms for multiple disabilities and our self-contained private schools are very similar in what they are. They lean heavily toward cognitive impairment mentality. So in fact, in order to be deemed multiply disabled, one of the things they have to have is a cognitive impairment. It's why I won't let that designation happen for any of the kids that I work with. In some states, they'll say, no, we'll say it's not cognitive, we'll say it's communication and motor. Okay. But any place else, I've had that happen once. Any place else, I just say, I want other health impaired because they have a genetic disorder. Let's not put anything in the mix that points to cognition being an issue. There's little or no curriculum for literacy in these self-contained multiple disability classrooms. There is, if anything, they're kind of stuck at an emergent level. They do a lot of emergent activities. I have a young girl that I'm working with now that is really doing a nice job with guided reading, but is only being read to. They're only doing shared reading. She's not getting the opportunity to read. Lovely school. They've got some really good people there, but she really needs to have it stepped up. And I think that in a school of multiply handicapped kids, sometimes they get kind of stuck in emergent. The communication options can be really limited. Again, if they're really thinking about this cognitive impairment issue as driving the wagon, there's a lot of, well, did they really mean to say that? Did they have to prove that they can say that before they can get more robust communication? You might see PECs, especially if it's an autism-based classroom. There's a lot of choices versus communication. They may have a stricter behavioral model because of some of the kids that they have in these classrooms. If they have a lot of kids with behaviors, and I'm going to say that is a huge roadblock. I do not like my kids who have no protective responses in classrooms where the kids have a lot of behavior. Because I love kids with autism, don't get me wrong, but I don't want them coming toward one of my kids when they're upset. And not having an adult there to get there quick enough could mean one of my kids gets injured. In these classrooms, there's a lot of expected motor responses. I've been in some rooms where these kids are really significantly impaired and they're still trying to impose a behavioral model, and I tell you what to do and you do it. And if you don't do it 10 out of 10 times, we don't move forward. And it's largely due to the fact that our kiddos with Rett can often be put in autism programs, and that's the ABA kind of not ABA, but the discrete trial kind of mentality. And if they're using BCBAs in the classroom, you have to understand that BCBAs are not teachers. They're trained in behavior, but they're not trained in instruction. Can be very data driven, which can be hard for kids that have a hard time expressing what they know all the time. And that we have to then teach them how to look for their yes, how to look for their no, how to give them breaks in between things, how to use an easy, hard system so they're not doing hard things over and over. How we're going to take data over a longer period of time and look for a trend line, because there's always going to be a day where you've got good, oh my gosh, they fell off the wagon. In those environments that say, see, they can't hold the information. Because we understand Rett, we know they just could be having a Rett day, where they totally understand it, but they couldn't get their body to respond. And in a data-driven program, largely due to the fact that they're using a discrete trial training model, that is really hard to shift. They've had limited communication training. It's behave and produce kind of an environment. Lack of curriculum. I'm in a situation now where this lack of curriculum is really getting difficult. I'm offering to come in and help these BCBAs figure out how the heck they're going to teach this kid who's a genius, but needs this environment because of his behavior. So I have kids that I work with whose behaviors are just abysmal, but are really bright. What do we do? There are no neurotypical peers for them to engage in, and I will tell you that it's highly unlikely a kid with autism is going to read their eye point or read their affect. And if you put two multiply disabled kids together, it's like the blind leading the blind. I think our kids need neurotypical kids that have affect that help carry them, that draw them in to help them be more peer-oriented and more successful in their peer interactions. Okay, so on the plus side, you have a really medically fragile kid with a lot of seizures, kids with maybe something else besides Rett. Maybe they have diabetes and they have Rett. They have a nurse on staff, typically in those classrooms that have multiple kids with multiple disabilities. They're in a building where there's a full-time nurse, or if they're in a self-contained school, set-aside school, they definitely have nurses on staff. They understand seizures. They're not going to be calling 911 every 2 seconds when a kid's having a seizure. The PTOT and SLPs are used to complex kids. You get an SLP in a general education building, and they're working on SSLs and Rs and working on some mild learning disabilities in terms of processing. I am not saying that they are going to be any better at using an eye gaze device or understanding how to set up communication for somebody with Rett, but they're at least used to seeing some devices, and they are used to seeing kids who are nonverbal. A self-contained school might have a pool, and for some people that might be the thing that they want for their kiddo because they know how much it helps them. It might be safer for our kids if there are no kids with autism. I mean, if they're not in a classroom for kids with autism who have behaviors, it might be safer because it's easier to manage kids that are not running around and, able-bodied. And there will be lots of equipment to support them. There will be a lot of equipment to support them. So, it's a big decision. It's a big decision as to where. And you will get pushed by the powers that be in districts to place kids certain places. I had an experience in California with one of my kids who is as sharp as a whip. Going into kindergarten, she already has sight words. She's already making words. She's using letters to make words. She's already using 1 to 3 letters, using her ABC flip book to spell words that you can recognize that go along with the story she's read on her device. This kid, no behaviors. And the person that was the overarching placement person for that area was pushing for her to go to a self-contained classroom, pushing the staff to say that's where she belonged. And they bucked her and said, no way. And of course, we weren't going to let it happen. But there are these preconceived notions about what would be best, and based on what people's opinions are that have nothing to do with your child. So be forewarned that people will have their preconceived notions, but it's really the hill you want to climb. And I'll tell you a short story about this. I ran a full inclusion program for the local school district that my kids went to. They made a decision that they wanted to bring all of their kids with autism out of these autism programs. They had them out in these co-ops and bring them back in district. And they asked me if I would come in as a consultant and run it. I said, sure. We did a lot of work. We did focus groups with parents, with the community, so that people understood what was going to happen. We did a lot of training with the kids in the classrooms that kids were going to go into. Did a ton of work with the teachers, did focus groups. What are your biggest fears? What are your biggest concerns? Let's get it all out there so we can talk about it. Carefully selected the teachers that the kids would go into so that at our first run, we would have a good experience. I had a young boy with autism that came into kindergarten, and he was a screaming Mimi. I mean, he had outbursts. He was not an aggressive kid. He just had outbursts. And it's interesting is one of the mothers came to me at open house and said, I have to tell you a story. We were at church, and a man stood up in the middle of the service and went, started talking out loud and kind of saying things out loud and then sat down. And my son nudged me and said, don't worry, Mom. It's okay. He just has autism. I'm like, okay, I think we've done our job. Anyway, kids doing really well, making tons of progress, learning how to read. At the end of the year, the school that had sent him sent some people over because they wanted to see how he was doing. And they said, could you do us a favor and point out the kid that you included from our program? I said, oh my gosh, if you can't find him, I don't think I want to point him out. He was just like everybody else in that classroom sitting and doing his work and learning. Here's the other part of the story. At the IEP, as you can imagine, I was shocked to hear that the parents wanted him to go to a private Jewish day school that I know would be a lovely school, but I know would not teach him to read and to write and to excel academically. I was heartbroken, and I asked the mom why. I had a really good relationship with the parents, and I asked the mom why, and she said, Susan, I know you guys are doing a great job, and I know he's doing a great job here, but every day my heart's in my throat that I'm going to get a call that he has done something horrible. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a horrible way to live your life. She did not have that feeling in the special needs school because everybody there had special needs. This was too much for their family to live with on a daily basis. Who am I to say different? I can make my recommendation, which I did, is that he stay, give all the reasons why. But every single one of your kids is not the family. They are part of your family. And when you make this decision, you need to decide what hill you want to climb. You're going to have to climb a hill in any place you put them, because Rett is not that understood. And if you want them to learn to read and write and communicate, and you have aspirations for their ability to learn, like the assumptions we made at the beginning, you're going to have to push a rock. You might have to stand waving your arms at people and giving a little bit of a definite loud. You might need support from the outside to come in and help train. But in the end, it is you and your family that has to make this decision. And it's you that has to put your head down on a pillow at the end of the night and say, okay, this is good. This is good for all of us. So we at Rett U are here to help in any way we can. We go into schools in person when that's going to be allowed. Right now, I'm doing remotes into schools to support them. I have a kiddo I'm supporting in Australia. It's working out great to do remotes because I can't go down there every time they need support. It's really working out well. And in a way, if they're struggling with a certain thing, for me to drop in for that period of the day a few times is a lot cheaper than me having to come for a day and support them. So we have the ability to help support you. We also have the ability to do some remotes with your kiddo to be able to show staff what we're doing that is helpful, that they can use to help them in their training. So we are here to do whatever it is that you need to make your hill a little less steeper to climb. So thanks for joining me at Rett U. Hope to see you in the halls of Rett U very soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.